Type interactions are one of the most important pieces of a Pokemon game. Ever since first making the rock, paper, scissors decision of fire, water, or grass, Game Freak showed us that learning the interactions between typings is fundamental to success. Otherwise, Hop would probably shut up about them for once in his life. While the type chart has been the same ever since Generation 6, a lot of important changes have been made over the years that brought us to where we are now. Some types got better, some got worse, and some radically altered the landscape of competitive Pokemon forever. I want to take a look through the generations and see what changes and features have affected the type chart and made it what it is today. And to do that, we obviously need to start at the very beginning with Red and Blue. Generation 1's type chart consisted of only 15 types, before the days of Dark and Steel, and long before fairies were in the picture. As the very first type chart, it shouldn't be surprising to hear that it was the least balanced one to date. The elephant in the room being the Psychic type. Psychic Pokemon had it made in Gen 1, with Bug being their only weakness. What made this even worse was that only 3 bug moves even existed in Gen 1. Outside of Jolteon with Pin Missile and Parasect with Leech Life, every Pokemon that could learn a bug move was weak to Psychic. But even between these two, Jolteon had base 65 attack to use Pin Missile with, and Leech Life was a base 20 power move in Generation 1. So basically, Psychics were never weak to anything. And for those of you wondering why the Ghost type doesn't come into play here, Psychic was actually immune to Ghost in Gen 1. But even if it was weak to Ghost, the only Ghost attack outside of Nightshade was Lick at base 30 power. It also didn't help that Psychic's only resistance in Gen 1 was Psychic. All of these factors, along with Gen 1's singular special stat, made Psychic Pokemon the most dominant type in these games. Thankfully, future generations would go on to fix this. Outside of Psychic's Reign of Terror, there were a few other minor differences that made the Gen 1 type chart unique. For one, Bug and Poison actually used to be super effective against each other. As 2 of the least common attacking types in Gen 1, a lot of people probably didn't even know this on their first playthrough. This change made a lot of sense from a logical standpoint, but it's unfortunate because both Bug and Poison could have used the extra offensive capabilities. In addition to this, Ice was actually neutral against Fire as well. I couldn't tell you why this was, but my guess is somebody did some mental gymnastics with Fire melting Ice, making Water, which is super effective against Fire, which just neutralized the whole thing? I don't know. Regardless, this change was probably influenced by the freeze status. If a Pokemon got frozen in Gen 1, they'd be frozen indefinitely with no chance of thawing unless they were hit with a Fire-type move. Instead of having this be the case, giving Pokemon a natural chance to thaw and giving Fire the overall advantage in that matchup just made sense. Then there are the Dragon types, or should I say, the Dragonite line. In Gen 1, the only Dragon move is Dragon Rage, which does a fixed 40 damage. So the reality is, the Dragonite line is using its Dragon typing solely for defensive reasons. This ended up working out well, as Dragon has several useful resistances. The last detail I want to mention for Gen 1 was the misinformation it would give players about type interactions. Only in Gen 1, if you used a move that was strong against one of a Pokemon's typings, but resisted their other type, it would hit for neutral damage like you would expect, but text would pop up saying it's not very effective or super effective, depending on the order of the Pokemon's types. While this didn't actually affect gameplay, it definitely went on to confuse some players on how typings interacted. Overall, the Gen 1 type chart had a lot of minor differences and one giant problem in the form of Psychic types, but a majority of the type interactions decided for these games have stayed the same all the way through to Gen 9. Generation 2 introduced a lot of new changes, primarily 2 new typings, Dark and Steel. Dark was brought in to balance out Psychic, which it did very well through its immunity. In fact, Dark's strength against Psychic alone made it one of the best performing types in the generation. Well, that and having Tyranitar on your team certainly helps. Plus, having only 2 weaknesses, one of which being the Bug type, helped make Dark types an easy decision for most team rosters. That being said, I think Steel is more of the standout here. While Dark types were more immediately necessary because of the threat of Psychics, Steel types would eventually go on to become one of the most essential typings for the metagame, mostly because of its insane amount of resistances. Out of 17 types in Gen 2, Steel resisted 11 of them. Not to mention an immunity to poison, which basically made it 12. This is crazy compared to Fire type, which has the second most resistances at only 5. If you count Steel's weakness to Fire, Fighting, and Ground, that left Steel with only 2 neutral interactions, which coincidentally enough, it was not very effective against. So basically no neutral interactions. This is pretty wild because every other type has mostly neutral interactions, but Steel's out here making enemies with everybody. That all being said, Steel wasn't a broken type upon its introduction. For one, it was only super effective against Ice and Rock, which both had plenty of weaknesses otherwise. Plus, it would take a few generations for Steel types to really build up a roster of threatening Pokemon. Don't get me wrong, Gen 2 had some impressive steel Pokemon like Scizor and Fortress, but they weren't taking the metagame by storm back then. In fact, Scizor technically wasn't even OU in Gold and Silver. Way back then, and even now, Steel is primarily a defensive typing, and its defensive role was very necessary for the next few generations to keep types like Psychic and Dragon from getting too out of hand. Both Steel and Dark were essential for balancing out the metagame, and ever since their introduction have continued to be two of the most prominent types to date. Outside the introduction of these two, the type chart saw a few other changes, all of which were the ones I mentioned were different back in Generation 1. This version of the type chart would stay for the next few generations, and we wouldn't see another big shift until Generation 6. That being said, the next few generations introduced a variety of features that impacted the way that players thought about their typings. Gen 3's indirect impact on the type chart came from abilities, as many of the abilities introduced directly affected type interactions. Some created immunities like Water Absorb, Lightning Rod, or in Shedinja's case, Wonder Guard, making it immune to anything other than a super effective attack. Others gave a Pokemon new resistances like Thick Fat, which gave Pokemon both an ice and fire resistance. This is actually the origin of the first ever Octo resistance, being a Spheal with Thick Fat taking an 8th damage from ice moves. Hope that information is useful for you, somewhere in the future. Several abilities even boosted the strength of a specific type of move such as Overgrow, Blaze, and Torrent that the starters had. Over future generations, more and more abilities were introduced that would affect type interactions, adding more layers to the way players went about their battles. Gen 4's influence on the type chart is arguably even less notable than Gen 3's, but its enactment of the physical special split did make a significant impact for many Pokemon. For those unaware, prior to Gen 4, all Pokemon moves were classified as either physical or special based on their type. If you ever go back and play an old Pokemon game and need to remember which type is which, any type that's an evolution as well as Dragon are special, and every other type is physical. Many Pokemon were at a disadvantage in previous games because their stats didn't really line up well with their typings. But now, these Pokemon finally had a chance to use their full power. This was most important for one type in particular, being Dragon. A lot of the Dragon types from previous gens couldn't use their Dragon moves to their full extent as the attacks were based on their special attack stat, and most of the Dragons up until now had been physical. But with this change, as well as Draco Meteor being introduced, Dragons began dominating the metagame even more than they already had. And with only one resistance in Steel, it didn't take long before the iconic Dragon Spam became a staple of the competitive scene. Gen 5 didn't introduce anything to affect the type chart, but it was the last generation to have the version introduced in Gen 2. Dragon types were at their peak in this generation, as there were a ton of strong Dragon Pokemon, but not a lot to oppose them. Steel types had become one of the best types over recent generations, solely because they were the only type that actually resisted Dragon. Well, that and they resisted everything else. However, Generation 6 finally put a stop to the Dragon domination with the introduction of the Fairy type. As the franchise's newest type, I'm sure a lot of you remember how heavily this impacted everything. Of course, Fairy's biggest role was stopping Dragons completely by being immune, but they also helped put a bit of a stop to the fighting and Dark type threats that were running rampant in the metagame. This is really sad for a Pokemon like Hydreigon that went from being at the top of the world in the generation it was introduced to being stopped in its tracks by a cupcake monster. But Fairy's biggest strength actually lies in its weaknesses, which were Poison and Steel. Up until this point, both of these types filled primarily defensive roles, with most teams not even bothering to run a Poison or Steel move on any of their Pokemon. But when the introduction of Fairies brought metagame-defining threats like Mega Gardevoir, Clefable, and Sylveon, both of these types finally had a reason to take up a move slot. This was really needed for Poison, which between Gens 2 and 5 was only good against Grass types, which funny enough was the type with the most weaknesses anyways. As for Steel, this made it even more important than it already was, as it went from being the main check to Dragons to being the main check for Fairies, while still helping to check Dragons and still checking a majority of the other types. It seems Game Freak realized how overpowered Steel types were about to become, so in Gen 6 they decided to change it, and Steel no longer resisted Ghost or Dark and is hit neutrally by both instead. I think this was a very necessary change for balance, and while Steel would still be one of the best types in the game, it wasn't so overpowered that it couldn't be dealt with. Overall, the introduction of Fairy types has had the biggest impact on the type chart to date, as it not only put an end to the era of Dragon Spam, but also saw the rise of a new dominant force in the metagame, and even made a few other types more important than they had been previously. While Gen 6 was the last to make a change to the type chart itself, future generations would introduce features or gimmicks that all centered around typings in some way. Gen 7 gave us Z Crystals, which were held items that would allow a Pokemon to launch off a strong attacking move of that crystal's type once per battle. That being said, Z crystals didn't add any further depth to type interactions themselves, so let's move on. Generation 8 gave us Dynamax, which allowed a Pokemon to go Ultra Chonk status for 3 turns. While the chonkiness of these mons can't be understated, the typing of their moves became important beyond simply super effective or not very effective. When Dynamaxed, a Pokemon's attacks became max moves, which have different effects depending on their type. Several max moves created weather, such as fire, water, rock, or ice. Some spawned terrain, like grass, electric, psychic, and fairy, and all the others either increased a stat for the user or decreased a stat for the opponent. A lot of the strategy in Generation 8 became figuring out which Pokemon was worth Dynamaxing and which moves were worth using in those 3 turns you were actually Dynamaxed. Sure, you could just go for your strongest attack, or you could find utility in using moves like Max Knuckle or Max Ooze to raise your offensive stats, or even use Max Airstream to give yourself a speed boost. While the act of Dynamaxing itself didn't have any effect on type interactions, the typing of max moves in particular became a very important aspect of the competitive scene. It seems like Game Freak wanted to avoid focusing on the type chart itself and focus more on how players look at and utilize certain typings. This concept comes to a head in Generation 9, where we have Terastallizing, allowing a Pokemon to change its type for the remainder of the battle. Terastallizing, like any other gimmick, has had a huge impact on competitive play, as not only do you have the ability to power up your stab attacks and do extra damage, but you can also go the defensive route and change into a completely new type in order to be a better counter. The perfect example of this is Skeledirge, whose most common Terra types aren't even one of its own. The nuanced strategy that goes into predicting which Pokemon will Terra and then into what type has added a layer of depth to competitive strategies that gives more casual players like myself a pretty big headache. Again, this feature and the couple before it have no direct effect on the type chart, but they change the way players think about the typing of their Pokemon, as well as how they plan for their opponents. And who knows, in Scarlet and Violet's Indigo Disc DLC coming in just a couple weeks, we could have a new piece to this that flips everything on its head. Unless Game Freak decides to introduce a new type completely, I don't picture any significant changes happening to the type chart in the near future. But what I do see is further depth and complication for the existing types. For all we know, the next generation's gimmick could be giving Pokemon a 3rd typing, which would really cause a headache. Regardless, we'll just have to wait and see what they decide to do next. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out some of my other videos if you haven't seen them already. And while you're watching that, I'll get working on some more. So for now, as thanks for making it to the end of the video, here's a picture of my dog. Talk to y'all soon.